In the autumn of 2001, a retired lineman named Walter Emmett Doss lay in a hospice room outside Fort Collins, Colorado, 4 days from the end of a life that had run 71 years without a single confession. His daughter, Carol Doss Ainsley, sat with him through most of those final nights. His grandson, a young man named Peter, came and went between work shifts. On the third night, with the window cracked and the room smelling faintly of the pine outside it, Walter asked his daughter to close the door. He told her there was something he had carried since he was 19 years old, something he had never once said out loud in 52 years, and that he needed to say it now while he still had the breath to finish the sentence. He told her that in the autumn of 1949, in a wheat field behind a grain elevator in eastern Colorado, something had found him, and that it had never, in all the decades since, entirely let him go. That is where this account begins. Not the field itself, not yet, but the room in which it was finally spoken, because the shape of a confession says almost as much as its content. A man does not wait 52 years to describe an encounter, unless the encounter demanded that silence of him, unless somewhere in those first hours after it happened, someone made the terms of his future speech very clear. What Walter Doss told his daughter in that hospice room, and what she began recording by hand within a day of hearing it, is the account this story follows to its end. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Walter Doss had grown up on his family's wheat operation outside a town called Akron, in the high plains of eastern Colorado, land flat enough that a person could watch weather arrive from 30 miles off. In 1949, he was 19 years old, unmarried, working the overnight shift at a grain elevator 3 miles from the house, a job that mostly meant watching gauges and keeping the night log. On his own time and his own dime, he had also wired together a shortwave receiver in the loft above the elevator office, a hobby picked up from an uncle who had served as a radio man in the Pacific. He kept a logbook of what he picked up, weather chatter, ham operators out of Nebraska and Oklahoma. Once, he told his daughter, a fragment of a broadcast from somewhere in Mexico that came in clear for 11 minutes and then vanished. He was, by his daughter's description and by the account of 2 surviving cousins, a careful young man, methodical in a way that made him good at his job and unremarkable to everyone who knew him. Nothing in his history before the 6th of November 1949 suggested a man who would spend the next half-century keeping a secret. On the night in question, Walter's logbook, the one that survived and that Carol now keeps in a fireproof box in her home in Loveland, records nothing unusual until nearly 2 in the morning. Then, in his own handwriting, a single line, tone came in wrong, not a station, followed it. He told his daughter what the words meant. The receiver had picked up something that was neither language nor static, a rising and falling pattern that repeated at even intervals, spaced closely enough that it felt built rather than born of weather. He said it did not feel like a broadcast. It felt, he told her, like something being said directly to him, in a room built for one listener. He left the loft and walked into the field behind the elevator, following, he said, not a direction so much as a pull, a sense that the source was close and wanted to be found. What he found, roughly 400 yards out into the stubble, was a light low to the ground that threw no shadow the way a lantern would, and beneath it, a figure. He described it to his daughter with the same care he had once used describing engine parts. Height near 4 feet 10 inches. Skin the color and texture of wet clay, grey with an undertone he could never settle on, blue in some light and green in others, a head too large for the body beneath it, in a way that should have looked wrong and instead looked deliberate, the way a tool looks deliberate even when its shape is unfamiliar. Eyes large, black without visible whites, set at a downward slant, and he said the strangest part was that despite their size, he never once felt watched by them the way he had expected. He felt red. The air around the light, he told his daughter, had a weight to it he could never adequately describe, colder than the November night around it, and somehow also without wind, as though the space itself had been sealed off from the rest of the field. He said the stubble beneath his boots made no sound, which struck him even at the time as wrong, since every other step he had taken that night had cracked audibly beneath him. He said there was a smell he could never place afterward, not chemical and not organic, present only within perhaps 30 feet of the light, and gone entirely once he stepped back outside that radius, a detail so specific that Carroll has never been able to decide whether it strengthens the account or simply deepens how strange it already was. There was no violence in what followed. He said the figure did not approach so much as remain, patient, at the edge of a fence line, for what he judged to be 6 or 8 minutes. The communication, if it could be called that, arrived the same way the tone had arrived over his receiver, not as words but as a pattern he could feel more than hear, pressing against the inside of his skull in the same rising and falling rhythm. He came away from those minutes certain he had been asked a question, though he could never afterwards say what the question was, only that some part of him had answered it, and that the answering had cost him something. He went back to the loft. He wrote nothing else in the log that night, beyond the line about the tone. 3 days later, 2 men in Army Air Forces uniforms came to the grain elevator and asked for him by name. They did not identify their unit. They asked what he had heard on the receiver on the night of the 6th, using that specific date before he had offered it, which was the detail he returned to most often in the retelling, the one that convinced Carroll something in the story was true, even when so much of it resisted proof. They took the receiver, they took that week's pages from the logbook, tearing them out rather than confiscating the whole ledger, which left a gap still visible today, a stub of torn paper between the entry for the 4th of November and the entry for the 11th. They told him, in words he repeated almost identically each time he told the story across those final nights, that he had not seen what he thought he had seen, and that if he described it to anyone, his family would suffer for it. He did not specify what family. He did not need to. There is one more record, thinner than the others but consistent with them. The family physician who treated Walter for a persistent nosebleed and headaches in the 2 weeks following the encounter, a doctor named Harlan Voss who practiced out of a single office in Akron for over 30 years, kept his patient files in a converted barn behind his house after retiring in the 1970s. That barn burned in a grass fire in 1983, and with it went every record Voss had kept of Walter Doss's visit, along with, Carroll was told by Voss's surviving son, most of the practice's other files from that same era. Carroll does not allege the fire was anything other than what the county reported it to be. She notes only that it removed the one piece of contemporaneous medical documentation that might have corroborated her father's account, in the same way that a torn ledger page and an unlocatable liaison report removed the others. His selective service file, a copy of which Carroll requested and received in the spring of 2003, shows a routine registration entry in the summer of 1949, and then nothing further until a reclassification notice the following spring, 18 weeks with no correspondence in a file otherwise unbroken for the 4 years surrounding it. The grain elevator's own employment ledger, portions of which survive in the County Historical Society archive, lists Walter Doss as employed through October of 1949 and shows no entry at all for November, an absence in a ledger that was otherwise kept with the same discipline he brought to his own private log. What his family noticed in the years that followed was something quieter than fear. Carroll is careful about this distinction every time she tells the story. Her father was not a haunted man. He was instead a man who kept a second life running alongside his first one, a life made almost entirely of listening. He rebuilt a receiver within a year of the original being taken, a habit his wife, Eleanor, later described to their daughter as the one thing about him she never fully understood and never asked him to explain. He kept new logbooks, dozens of them across the decades, most filled with the ordinary chatter of a man who liked radios. But threaded through those decades Carroll found after his death were entries that recurred with a pattern of their own. The same tone, described the same way each time, rising and falling at the same interval, arriving on nights with no calendar logic Carol has ever been able to identify, though she has tried. Going back through 41 years of surviving logbooks, she counted 22 occurrences of what her father had taken to calling, in his own private shorthand, the visitor's tone. The last entry is dated the 9th of September 2001, 6 weeks before he told her anything at all. Eleanor, Walter's wife of 46 years, never heard the full account before her own death in 1994, but she left behind fragments of her own. In a letter to her sister dated 1951, 2 years into her marriage, she wrote that her husband sometimes woke in the middle of the night and simply stood at the window for 10 or 15 minutes without explanation, and that when she asked him about it, he would only say he was checking the weather, in a tone she described in the letter as not quite a lie and not quite the truth either. She never pressed him further. Carol found the letter, along with several others, in a shoebox among her mother's belongings after Eleanor's death, 7 years before her father finally spoke. There is a comparable account, collected years earlier, by a Colorado researcher named Dale Ferris, from a lineman working substations outside Ogallala, Nebraska, in the early 1950s, who described a tone coming through a maintenance radio one night in June of 1952, followed by an encounter in a field beside the substation with a small pale figure that communicated, in his words, like something pressing on the radio in his chest instead of his ears. That witness, recorded by Ferris only as R. Kessling at the man's own request, also reported a visit from military personnel within the week, also reported missing employment records for the same period, and also reported that the tone recurred across the following decades, unpredictable, always in the same rising and falling shape. Ferris found a second account from 1954, a rail yard worker outside Winnipeg, who described the identical rhythm, though he had never heard of Doss or Kessling and had no access to either man's testimony. 3 men, 3 decades, one recurring pattern none of them could have learned from the others. What binds these accounts is not simply the tone, though the tone is the detail that resists the easiest dismissal. It is the shape of the silence that followed each of them, the same instruction delivered in different words across 3 different decades, the same missing week in 3 otherwise ordinary employment records, the same choice, made independently by 3 men who never met, to hold the story until the very end of a life and then release it whole, complete, to the people closest to them. That is not the pattern of invention. Invention tends to spread itself across a life, tested in pieces, revised in the telling. What Walter Doss gave his daughter in that hospice room had clearly been finished a long time before he finally said it out loud. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Carol has her own fragment of memory that she did not understand until her father's confession gave it a shape. She was 7 years old, she believes, on a summer night in 1964, woken by her father standing at the edge of their yard in Akron with the porch light off, facing the field behind the property, in a stillness she remembers finding, strange enough that she never forgot it, though she had no context for it until 37 years later. She asked him the next morning what he had been doing. He told her he had heard an owl. She believed him for 37 years. She does not believe him now. She recalls, too, a rule her father enforced without ever explaining it, that no one in the family was to run the tractor or leave equipment idling in the north field after dark, a rule her mother followed without complaint, and her brother once broke as a teenager, drawing from their father a reaction Carol describes as the only time in her childhood she saw him truly frightened rather than simply serious. Her brother Richard, 2 years younger than Carol, was not present for their father's final confession, having died in a car accident in 1989, a fact Carol mentions with the particular flatness of a grief that has had time to settle into fact rather than wound. She wishes Richard could have heard what their father said, because Richard had once, as a boy of about 9, asked their father directly whether he believed in flying saucers, prompted by a magazine article he had read, and their father had given him an answer that seemed strange even at the time. A long pause, and then 5 words. Believing isn't really the question. Richard remembered the line for the rest of his short life. He repeated it to Carol more than once, always slightly puzzled by it, never suspecting what sat behind it. In the months after the funeral, Carol went through the surviving logbooks with the help of her son Peter, who had studied electrical engineering, and offered, at her request, to look at the tone pattern itself, to see whether it resembled anything documented in the ordinary spectrum of shortwave interference. He could not find a match. He described the pattern as structured in a way atmospheric interference does not produce, evenly spaced, self-similar across recordings separated by years, the kind of signal that in any other context he would assume had been generated on purpose by whoever was sending it. He offers no opinion on what that purpose was. He says only that it was not noise. Walter told Carol, in one of those final nights, that he had come to believe, without ever being able to prove it to his own satisfaction, that the tone was not communication in the sense of a message meant to be decoded, but something closer to a signature, a way of confirming that the same presence which had stood at the fence line in 1949 was still, across 5 decades, aware of him specifically. He said he never again saw the figure with his own eyes after that first night. He said the tone had been enough, that some part of him had come to find it reassuring rather than frightening, a kind of proof that whatever happened to him in that field had not simply used him once and moved on. He said, and Carol wrote this down almost verbatim that same night, because she sensed even then that the words mattered, that he had spent 52 years wondering whether the question he had been asked in that field was meant for him personally, or whether he had simply been the nearest available listener to a signal aimed at something larger than one 19-year-old on a night shift in eastern Colorado. The Air Force's own historical index for facilities operating in that region during 1949 contains a routine personnel movement report for the first 2 weeks of November that year, filed from a base roughly 90 miles from the Doss family farm, listing a field liaison visit to a civilian site, agricultural, unincorporated, without further identification, the kind of vague notation that appears nowhere else in the surrounding pages of that same index. Carol requested a fuller record under the Freedom of Information Act in 2004. The response she received describes the underlying report only as unable to be located, a designation the letter does not further explain, and that sits apart from anything marked classified or withheld, pending review, an absence with a shape of its own. She wrote back once asking whether the index entry itself could be expanded upon by anyone still on staff who might recall a field liaison assignment from that period. The reply she received, 3 months later, thanked her for her inquiry and stated that no further information was available at this time. The surviving logbooks, the torn stub of the November ledger page, and copies of the correspondence with the Air Force are now kept together in the fireproof box in Carol's home in Loveland, alongside the recorder Peter used to digitize what tone samples remain legible on the oldest, most degraded tapes. Dale Ferris's original interview notes with Kessling, and what little could be gathered about the Winnipeg witness before that trail went cold, are held in a private research collection in Denver, with no public catalogue and no institutional affiliation, the kind of archive that exists because one person decided something mattered enough to keep, not because any agency decided it was worth preserving. What connects Walter Doss to Kessling in Nebraska and to the unnamed rail worker in Winnipeg is not proof in any legal sense. None of the 3 men left behind a signed statement that would satisfy a courtroom. What they left instead is a pattern repeated across 3 decades and 3 states of a tone with the same shape, a silence enforced by the same kind of visit inside the same narrow window of days, a gap in employment or service records matched precisely to the encounter, and a confession withheld until the very end of a long life and then delivered whole, without hesitation, as though it had been rehearsed in private for 50 years. That is the profile of a man finally setting down something he had been asked, in whatever way that field asked it of him, to carry alone. Walter Doss died 2 days after finishing his account, in the early hours of the morning, with Carol asleep in the chair beside his bed and Peter in the hallway. The hospice nurse present that night, a woman named Renata Kwan, told Carol afterward that in the last hour, without regaining full consciousness, Walter's right hand moved twice across the blanket in the same slow rising and falling pattern, a motion she assumed at the time was simple restlessness, and which Carol, hearing the description months later, recognized immediately as the shape of the tone her father had spent 52 years transcribing. Whatever waited for him in that wheat field in 1949 did not, by any account his family can offer, ever return to take him. It marked him instead, and kept marking him across 5 decades of an ordinary life spent learning which mistakes were forgivable and which required him to leave the porch light off and go stand in the dark. If the tone was a message, its content is lost, torn out of a logbook by 2 men whose names were never given. If it was a signature, the record shows it repeated 22 times across 41 years, and then stopped completely 6 weeks before the man who received it finally said its name out loud to the one person he trusted to hear it. What remains is a torn page, a missing report, a gap in a selective service file, and a daughter who now stands, some nights, at her own back window, listening for a sound she has never once heard and cannot say whether she is hoping for. What was the question the field asked him at 19 years old, and did he ever truly answer it, or only believe that he had? What did the tone carry across those 22 recorded returns? Encouragement, instruction, or simply confirmation that someone was still listening on the other end of whatever line opened between them in 1949? Kessling in Nebraska and the rail worker in Winnipeg are gone now too, their accounts preserved only in a researcher's private files, uncatalogued, and with no guarantee of surviving another generation. What happens to a pattern once the last men who lived it are no longer here to describe it? Carol does not know. She keeps the logbooks anyway in the fireproof box, in case the tone, whatever it was, is still out there, waiting for someone new to hear it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.